Hi everyone, welcome to ArtStoryLab. My name is Hejin. Every year or so, we hear in the news about a painting that sells at a record price at an auction. Fetching hundreds of millions of dollars, paintings have solidified their place in our culture as the most expensive type of art. But in early modern Europe, artworks that commanded the highest prices and prestige were not paintings, but tapestries. Hand-woven with wool, silk, and metallic threads, and displaying brilliant colors and elaborate designs, early modern European tapestries were the most labor and capital-intensive form of art. Consequently, they were available exclusively to the uppermost crust of society. Tapestries decorated interiors as wall hangings, and with their expansive sizes, insulated, drafty interiors. And you may be wondering, why do these historic tapestries in museums look so weird with this brownish color cast? That's because the dyes that give them their colors fade easily when exposed to light. They're also made of organic fibers like wool and silk, which are very fragile. So when looking at tapestries that have endured centuries of wear and tear, you have to remember that their colors were much brighter when they were fresh off the loom. One of my favorite tapestry sets from early modern Europe is this one, titled The Story of the Emperor of China. This set was created at the turn of the 18th century by the Beauvais Tapestry Manufactory in France. It includes 9 scenes depicting what the French imagined as a court life in the Qing Empire. The scenes show the Emperor of China taking a light meal with the Empress, sailing, having a scholarly discussion with astronomers, traveling in a palanquin, returning from a hunt, and holding an audience, as well as the Empress watching a pineapple harvest, taking tea, and sailing. Up to this point, the French had not had very much direct contact with the Chinese, and they did not have an embassy in the Middle Kingdom. That's Chinese name for China. So their representations of China were largely based on book illustrations and engravings, as well as written descriptions. The designers of these tapestries took numerous motifs from illustrations in 17th century books on the Dutch East India Company's activities in China, as well as those discussing the missionary efforts of the Catholic Order of the Jesuits there. You can see the mixture of vaguely Asianized features and European elements, as well as those of other parts of Asia in these large artworks. Take for example the scene of the collation, where the emperor wearing a fur turban topped with peacock feathers and a pearl drop earring is sharing a light meal with the empress sporting a trailing veil and holding a folding fan in her hand. The couple sits under a garden pavilion topped with European versions of winged dragons, decorated with lambrequin and rich drapery. A musician playing a sitar-like instrument, a dwarf dancer, and a monkey entertain them. A female attendant on the right foreground throws incense into a brazier, and a male servant in the background reaches for the impressive buffet, displaying silver platters and blue and white Chinese porcelain vessels, very similar to the ones depicted in banquet still life such as this one. The collation is taking place on a raised platform covered with a lush Near Eastern carpet, while the tiled, hipped roofs of the palatial complex is visible in the background. This is a real hodgepodge of markers of leisure and status in Europe and many different exotic lands, not only China but also Southeast Asia, India, and Turkey. And in this scene, the Empress is presiding over a pineapple harvest. Apparently, pineapples were brought to China from Brazil via the Caribbean, and in Europe, the fruit was one of the rarest delicacies. A tall banana tree and this weird coconut tree are just outside the palace complex with the pagoda in the distance. Coconuts, bananas, and pineapples right outside the Forbidden City in the heart of Beijing? These are highly imaginative renderings of China mediated by European imagination. This scene of the astronomers most explicitly visualizes the intermingling of the Chinese and the European. It shows the emperor conversing with European scientists with several astronomical instruments under a spindly covered arcade that looks nothing like actual East Asian architecture. The emperor is standing and gesturing towards the heavens, while the seated bearded European figure holds a pair of dividers above a luxuriously decorated globe. Behind them, a man is looking through a telescope pointed to the sky. A little boy, presumably the heir to the throne, is studying astronomy, while an older man stands in front of an armillary sphere. All displaying elaborate mounts, these instruments are based on actual astronomical devices that were crafted in China to the instructions of a Jesuit missionary in 1673, and several of them survive today. And scholars have suggested that the white bearded figure represents an actual Jesuit priest, one of the several that traveled to China to proselytize the Middle Kingdom in the 17th century. The Jesuits' strategy of converting the Chinese people was a top-down approach, infiltrating the imperial court by teaching Western scientific knowledge to the emperor and high-ranking Qing officials. Thus, the theme of astronomy is pointing to the Catholic evangelization efforts in China. Despite all this, the European attempt to convert the Chinese to Christian faith proved futile, because Christianity was fundamentally at odds with the Chinese ideology of the emperor as a son of heaven. And in this belief system, China was the Middle Kingdom, the literal center of the world, the supreme empire with no equals. And in 1722, the emperor officially put an end to Catholic evangelization in China. The art historian Christopher Johns explains that the termination of Catholic missionary activities and the failure to establish direct diplomatic ties with the Qing court had profound impact on European representations of China. In the Story of the Emperor of China series, produced when there was still hope for the Europeans to increase their foothold in the empire, China seen through the lens of European fantasy is a land of refined culture. Its emperor engages in what is thought in Europe as masculine activities fit for a monarch, such as hunting, riding majestically in a palanquin, and cultivating scientific knowledge. All the things that they could imagine their rulers doing in Europe. But later in the 18th century, a different set of tapestries representing the same subject paints a very different picture of the Qing emperor and his court. In these tapestries, titled Tongture Chinoise or Chinese hangings, made after the designs by the preeminent French painter François Boucher from the early 1740s, the emperor appears quite different. Let's compare the audience scenes from the two series, and here I'm showing you an engraving made after Boucher's design for the later series so that you can make out the scene more clearly. The compositions of these two scenes are very similar. We see the emperor seated on a raised platform in the center, underneath an architectural structure divided in three parts, and in front of the emperor, his subjects kowtow to him. But the effect of the two scenes couldn't be any more different. In the earlier tapestry, the focus of the scene is quite clear. Yes, the emperor's court is rendered in a fantastical tone, with an elephant behind the throne, exotic birds in the sky, and a gravity-defying, whimsical arcade framing him. But the scene clearly revolves around him with its sense of order. In contrast, the emperor in Boucher's design is no longer the focus of the narrative. He's sort of buried in this general chaos of people and things. Unlike the authoritative pose of the earlier emperor holding a scepter, this later counterpart appears dazed and uninvolved, surrounded by the empress and several other women. The female attendants are even toying with the ribbons in his headgear. In this scene titled The Chinese Dance, the emperor appears in the same manner, looking rather dissipated and languid, wrapped in the smoky perfume and passively watching the entertainment. The French definitely did not depict their king like this. Doing so would have been clearly recognized as disrespecting the crown. Taking extreme creative license, the French overtly exoticized the Qing court to the point of derogatory distortion in the Chinese hanging series. This moment, the historian Johns points out, is the seed of the yellow peril that would later dominate the Western representations of East Asia in the modern era, which is a whole can of worms that I'll cover in a separate episode. What's curious about this later set of tapestries is that the French king Louis XV and his officials sent it to the Qianlong emperor as an informal gift. The gesture was meant to curry favor with the emperor and entice the Chinese elite to buy French luxury goods. At this time, there was a huge trade imbalance between Europe and China, because while the European demand for Chinese goods, namely porcelain, silk, and lacquerware, was really high, Europe didn't have much to offer to the Chinese. So that makes you wonder, why did the French send luxury objects that cast the Chinese emperor in such an unflattering tone? One theory is that by this time, the fantasized image of China had become so entrenched in European culture that the French court didn't even realize that they could be offensive to the Chinese recipient. And what's really fascinating is that upon receiving these gifts, the Qianlong emperor built a European-style pavilion in his palace to house these enormous tapestries, which was clearly a thumbs up. One possible explanation for this equally perplexing reaction is that these European-made images of China didn't look anything like actual China, and the emperor understood them rather as images of the French court at Versailles. So it seems that this French gift of tapestries to the Qing court was very much built on mutual misunderstanding. In this ironic twist, each side appreciated exoticized representations of the other. The French with their depictions of the imagined China, and the Chinese with what they took to be depictions of the French. What do you think about these astounding gifts from France? Why do you think the French sent these potentially offensive tapestries to China that could have totally backfired on them? If you have any guesses, do let me know in the comment section below. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. See you next time on ArtStoryLab.